Welcome to Event Horizon with Mark Anthony Peterson, the show where we take a walk into the paranormal with a splash of the conspiracy. Guys, today is going to be a crazy episode. Why? Because I have a crazy theory about the universe. I actually believe the universe is a loaf of bread. I know. I flipped my wig, right? Well, if it's not a loaf of bread may symbolize how the universe works. How did I come to this? Well, I was sitting and watching a show, and someone said, "So as above, so as below." And that got me thinking. What comes from above symbolizes what happens below, and everything that I have read of what is above made me think of bread. Again, I know you think I flipped my freaking wig. But let's dig into it. Why am I so obsessed with the universe being bread, or at least operating like bread? Because everywhere in the Bible, it tells you that God is bread. In biblical times, bread was life, because that was the universal food that bound everyone together. And so throughout the Bible, everything of significance is referred to in reference to bread. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. You keep going and you get to give us this day our daily bread. John 6:32 through 35. Truly, truly, I say unto you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but thine Father gives the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. 1 Corinthians 10:17. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body. For we shall partake of the one bread. Matthew 26:26. Take, eat, this is my body. Referring to the bread as symbolizing God. John 16:50. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. Psalms 78:24. He rained down manna, bread, upon them to eat, and gave them food from heaven. Jesus is called the bread of life. And if anyone eat his flesh, they will live forever. Bethlehem means house of bread. The Bible speaks of bread in a context where we look at it as either from heaven or representing God. So there has to be some significance if the bread is the key to life. So as above, so will be below. And so I looked at that and said, they just can't be talking about it symbolically. It has to mean more. Bread has to represent a set of functions that tell us how the universe works. So I started to think, what do we know about bread? What do we know about bread in the context of the Bible? The Bible speaks of bread in two types, leaven and unleavened. And this is where it started to get weird for me, because that almost makes me think of yin and yang. The leavening process in the Bible symbolizes the corruption of sin. Unleavened bread symbolizes eternal life. The unleavened bread, the dense bread that you eat as part of a sacramented church, is symbolizing eternal life, the uncorrupted bread. Doesn't have a rising agent in it, does not have a chemical reaction that forces in air bubbles and causes it to rise. Unleavened bread is generally flat, like a pizza, flat. Now this is going to get a little trippy, because some of you who've argued for flat earth theory probably should have been arguing for flat universe theory, because maybe that's how the universe started out. Flat, unleavened, no rising agent, no energy to cause it to expand, so it was an unleavened universe. Leavened bread has the yeast or baking powder that causes the fermentation, or the sin, that expands the dough. Not sounding as crazy, but it's still a little crazy, right? Matthew 13 and 33 provides a pretty good parable of leavened bread. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it was worked all through the dough. So the universe started out unleavened and got mixed with a yeast all throughout the dough and created a kingdom, created a universe that expanded and produced life. So the kingdom that we live in, the universe that we live in, grew from a small beginning, grew from a flat leaven beginning to expand into multiple dimensions, because there was something introduced to cause it to expand. Some people refer to it as the Big Bang. People speculated what sparked that Big Bang, but if we look at how bread moves from flat to rising, from leaven to unleavened, there was an agent introduced that caused a chemical reaction. That agent was yeast. Small, microscopic life that plays the role, the catalyst that expands the dough. It kicks off a chemical reaction. The yeast makes the dough rise and initiates the bang. The yeast does its job slowly, silently, and it will grow and change whatever it contacts. So what if our universe was exactly like that, flat? Microscopic life introduced to it triggers a reaction that begins a bang that produces an expansion. An expansion that fuels air bubbles, gas bubbles, indefinitely until you see the expansion of a hot universe. Much like bread. That's exactly how bread works. The gas bubbles that are formed from the chemical reaction within bread causes it to rise. Now, our universe it's speculated that it works the same way, that these bubbles that formed after the Big Bang produce the potential for infinite multiverses. Hawkings and others talk about an eternal inflation where bubbles of space will expand and some will slow or stop on their trajectory and create small fractional dead end static space. In other bubbles of space, there are quantum effects where the inflation never stops. So much like bread, where there's never truly an even amount of heat or rising of the dough, you get expansion in ways that you don't always expect. Because you can never get a very pure mixture of what it takes to cause that dough to expand. But according to Hawkings, when a bubble stops inflating, stars and planets form. Life. Now, does that happen within bread? When those air pockets, those gas pockets that are formed by the carbon dioxide that has been created from the yeast chemical mixture within bread occur? I see some interesting parallels. Now, Hawking's eternal inflation theory predicts that globally our universe is like a infinite fractional pocket that it's separated by an inflating ocean. That there's a multiverse of pockets that have similar characteristics, and that some of those pockets could be creating other pockets. So expanding off of the original air bubble to create multiple bubbles around the original bubble. And because the regions expand exponentially rapid, most of the volume in the universe at any given time may be inflating. Now, you've had this theory of eternal inflation put forth since the late 70s by guys like Alan Guth and Coley and Haslam, where they've argued different aspects of the eternal inflation theory, introducing concepts like quantum fluctuations to explain whether or not the expansion will go on eternally, or if it will produce the types of gas bubbles that form universes. And as you go through these different nuanced theories, you start to think they're talking about making bread. Really? It simply boils back to, are you making a loaf of bread? So let's talk about that. How do you make it? The alcohol is what gives bread its typical baked taste. The carbon dioxide expands as the dough is warmed, causing the bread to rise, and the starches are converted into sugars, and subsequently they metabolize to carbon dioxide. Now, as we talked about, yeast, that small single cell organism that feeds off of the simple sugars and breaks them down into carbon dioxide, alcohol, flavor molecules, and energy, these guys, if you get it right, you get a normal expansion of the bread Too much yeast causes extra air bubbles to form, creating huge holes in your bread. Now, what does that sound like? Huge holes throughout the bread. Quick passages, right? From the front end to the back end of the bread. We had one guy talk about stuff like that, Einstein and Rosen, and they talked about a bridge, a hole that connected time-space. Now, as the dough rises and proofs, carbon dioxide is formed, and that's why the dough has volume and it increases and expands. The CO2 expands the dough and produces these gaseous bubbles. The more CO2 you have, the faster the bread will rise. So as we look at the theories that talk about universal expansion and the rate of expansion, we are looking at an unleavened universe to a leavened universe where chemical agents, single cell organisms were introduced to an environment that may have produced the right mixture for a bang that caused the universe to expand in the exact same way that bread rises. Now, when the yeast breaks down the sugar, transforming it into carbon dioxide and ethanol, they produce those in equal parts. Two molecules of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of ethanol. Now, here's where it gets interesting when we start talking about the bread making process and comparing it to real life universal expansion. Gluten. Many of you who have gluten allergies probably hate gluten, but within bread, gluten is what makes the bread lighter. Because without it, the gas bubbles in the bread dough would be lost. Gluten plays the crucial role in bread by trapping the bubbles of gas. You take the gluten out and you have denser bread. For those of you who've chomped on non-gluten bread, you wonder, wow, man, this bread is dense. You pick up a small loaf of that non-gluten bread at Publix or Safeway or Kroger, it feels like a little mini brick. Whereas you pick up a big long loaf of that nice white bread and it feels like a feather. Lots of gluten made it light and rise. Okay. Yeast plays a role in the development of that gluten. So single cell organisms' life helps create gluten that binds the bubbles in the bread that causes it to rise. Now, we have elements in the universe that we can't now completely explain, like gravity, that plays a role in binding the elements together, but we don't understand how it works to make the universe expand. So that makes me wonder, is gluten the equivalent of our universal gravity? Well, let's move on to the next element. The next element is salt. The next element is salt. Salt plays a role in tightening gluten structure and adding strength to the dough. It helps the loaf to hold the carbon dioxide gas that is formed during the fermentation process and gives bread good volume. Salt obviously seems like it's pretty important. In the Bible, we refer to people as the salt of the earth. Salt is also used in sacraments. It's spread in front of thresholds as divine protection. Could salt also be the equivalent of one of these universal forces that help with the binding of the universe and the expansion of our universe? The final piece that kind of threw me for a loop: bread has to rise twice in order to prevent some of the giant gaping holes that I talked about earlier. This made me think of two things. The theory that we have of the Big Bang may be actually the Big Bang Bang, if it follows the parallel of baking bread. There's an interesting parallel to the Bible as well, because Christ had to rise or be born twice in order to prevent some of the gaping holes that would have damned souls to hell. Very interesting perspective. So now that we got to look at how bread works, what do I think really happened? Bread as the universe. Well, I think it started out flat, like a pizza, like I said earlier. Pizza dough, unleavened. Because before there was anything, there was just God. Before there were the heavens and the earth, before there was light, there was just God. Flat, unleavened bread. That flat, unleavened bread is what is fed to Christians worldwide as the source of salvation, as the symbol of God. So before there was anything, the universe was, for lack of a better term, pizza dough. Unleavened pizza dough, flat bread. What changed it? Something or God added life. Yeast, a single-celled organism that triggered a set of events. And that single-celled organism must have had some form of light. Ultraviolet. Maybe triggered by sound. But it triggered an enormous event that generated the heat that caused the universe to expand. Converting unleavened bread to leavened bread, or a leavened universe, that triggered the reaction that we live in now. With all the byproducts that we see in bread. Gravity, like gluten, binding the universe together, forcing a set of laws that allow us to predict how things work. Helping bubbles of gas to expand and create dimensions and universes within that expansion. But like bread, the universe will eventually decay. Mold may be our equivalent of anti-life in the universe. Mold, unlike plants, does not grow from seeds. It comes from spores that float in the air and that look for dark, damp places. Places where there is no ultraviolet light, the light of the universe, the light of God. Mold is that dark matter that, when confronted with light matter, creates nothingness. So when the conditions are right for mold, just like the conditions were right for expansion, there will be universal decay. A slow process in which the matter of the universe is converted and broken down by anti-life matters, like mold. So when we get, I guess, a damp, dark universe, we'll expect to see that process triggered. So the next time you order Domino's or Little Caesars, or even go into your grocery store and get that piece of bread, right? You want to take a good hard look at it and think about it. Because when I took a look at it the last time, I started thinking, wow, if this bread were the universe, there's some of those universes, some of those gas bubbles that are closer to the surface. There's some that are closer to the center that are probably not as hot as the ones that may be closer to the surface, depending on where the energy source, the heat source, is coming from. And if that's the case, what does it say about the bubbles that are closer to the surface versus those that are closer to the middle? Are those older bubbles more advanced? Those closer to the surface? Do they have a better view of the entire universe and how it works? What about the crust of that bread? Those organisms, that yeast that makes it to the crust, that edge of the bread. What are they like? Are they like the characters that we see in Marvel, like Thanos? Those early life forms that came out of the beginning of the universe, the early expansion. So they were born with different properties and strengths and immortality. Whereas those that were born closer to the center of the bread did not have those same properties because of the changing chemical process in the universe. Right? Because there may have been quantum fluctuations in the ingredients. Less gluten, more gluten, too much yeast, not enough yeast, where you get fluctuations in the expansion, producing sometimes different flavors within the bread. I started to think about that and wonder that if that were to occur and there were life forms born at different parts of the bread, would that imbue them with different viewpoints and abilities to assess what the bread is all about? Because for those in the center, all they see is bread in every direction. Whereas those on the edge know that there's something in the bread, but they also know that there's something completely different beyond the bread. Those on the edges, those slices of the bread that are totally crusted on either end, the front and back, what is their perspective? They didn't expand to a full slice like those in the middle. Does that denser bread have denser gravity? Less gluten? My universal bread theory got me thinking about all different types of bread. Outside of just the leavened and unleavened, to wonder if different mixes in the unleavened dough that produces the different flavors of bread produces different forms of humanoid. So maybe the God figures who are kneading the dough and making the universes are experimenting with different flavors of universes. The funny thing between us and our ancestors is that we've learned to protect the bread from air, from the natural process of life, the mold. We put sleeves on it to keep the air, put them in refrigerators to extend their life. Whereas our forefathers did not have those, and so the bread followed a natural cycle of life. They used organic seeds, did not pervert the raw ingredients in order to extend its life. And they did not inject ingredients that would repel life that would naturally consume those raw ingredients. Maybe that's why leavened bread comes with it the symbol of corruption and sin. Because once you start that process, you create that balance, or that tug of war for the balance of dark and light. I don't know. Like I told you, this was a crazy show. Because, to me at least, I could start to see how bread reminded me of the universe. I'd love to know what you think, because I'm going to go get a sandwich. This has been Event Horizon, a walk into the paranormal with a splash of the conspiracy.